All right, hello. Welcome to the beginning video voice lecture of the review of The Last Roman, a total war game created by Creative Assembly, and this is about Belisarius' expedition in conquering North Africa and Italy. Though we'll just be focused on North Africa for this because it actually became a massive project and it would have been hours of me blabbering. So I decided to condense it for your your time and sanity. But starting off, we have the massive world of the Mediterranean, Italy up here, Libya, North Africa down here. This cloud stuff is to indicate fog of war, not knowing what's going on. But as you can see, if I go into the map overview, this is the focus where Belisarius' expedition happened, part of the Eastern Roman Empire right here. And yeah, the Mediterranean is a central barrier or transit point region, the Western Mediterranean that is, into all of the land that Belisarius eventually tries to reconquer. Now, right off the bat, something sad is that the journey to get to North Africa was 3 months long and terrifying for the Romans. And that is immediately cut out. You start already in North Africa. And to Procopius's travels, or to his histories, the Romans are supposed to start by, they land in North Africa by Selectus after they were in uh, Sardinia for a moment, right over by southern Italy. No Selectus anywhere around here. Other towns. It's possible that they went back in and looked at, some historical sources or notes and decided that these were the more prominent towns. So mentioning a small town or village like Selectus was kind of unimportant. So instead, you just have them out here in the middle of just Africa, not really by anything. You have a a large lake oasis thing here, and of course, anyone who's read the histories of the wars, by Procopius, it was mentioned that when they landed, a large spring erupted out of the ground to give them fresh water, as if God was, sanctioning their mission. But what's really sad here is the complete lack of the Navy. The Navy was pivotal in getting them over here. 500 ships, according to Procopius, and followed along the shore as they liberated land along the coast to get to North Africa. So the lack of the Navy is alarming. It clearly shows that there isn't much interest or indication of interacting with the Mediterranean, the ocean, that is, in any meaningful way. So that's a disappointment. However, we have our armies here. We have
Commander,
the Watchmen under Belisarius, and then we have a smaller army, the Vanguard Army, under John the Armenian, which was accurate. However, of course, there was much more officers and commanders, but the two biggest figures in the North African campaign in the Vandal Wars would have been
ready
Belisarius
for battle.
and John. So we have that going on here. And then if we look at the compositions,
Commander,
we have some interesting things going on again. We have Foederati, which would mean roughly kind of like foreign troops, or a better way to put it would be treaty or vassal troops. So these would have been treaties that were made with barbarian kingdoms or tribes, or specifically tribes or barbarian kingdoms that were defeated or were given permission to settle on the border in exchange for fighting for the Romans. However, in Justinian's Men, the author mentions that it is more likely that these units should be viewed more as kind of a large special forces unit. They weren't really all barbarian at the time. These could have been anyone from around the empire and would have been long-term professional soldiers signing up to fight that specialized in a certain in a specific type of warfare. In this case, you can right-click on them, and the game will tell you a little blurb. And as you can see here, it says barbarians who fight for Roman Germanic tradition. Traditionally, that's what they were. However, as we get into the 6th century, according to Justinian and his men, that wasn't always the case, and they could fight in a variety of styles. Here, it appears to be just a spearman. but they also are swordsmen. But they do also have their ranged missile weapon, which would have been a javelin-like weapon that they tossed. That is actually something that, that these barbarians tribals would have gotten from the older legions. They would have been, at this time period, large darts, not javelins anymore, or pilma that the Romans threw, the legionaries threw back in the day. On top of that, you have your exploratores. So these would have been like the recon, the scouts. Definitely would have happened. Would they have made it this large of a proportion of the army? Probably not. And then, interestingly enough, you have your Limentani. And as I mentioned, and when we get into a actual battle here, this is just a campaign map, kind of like a board game where you move your armies around. And then when you fight, it turns into like a real-time battle where you're moving all these units around on a battlefield. This would be a field army because it's there's two types of military organizations in the Roman Empire at this time period in the 6th century. You have your field armies and your frontier armies. And the Limentani would have been the soldiers that kind of like your militiamen in the frontier armies protecting the borders. So the fact that they make up, them and the Foederati make up the overwhelming, they make up almost all of the infantry force of Belisarius' expedition at this time, seems to be more or less a gross exaggeration. It probably would have been more likely Comitatenses. The Comitatenses were the soldiers in the field armies, and the field armies were the ones that went on the offensive, that invaded, that attacked, and were kept in reserve in safe areas of the empire to react to enemy incursions, or again to go on expeditions like Belisarius did. And in fact, most of Belisarius's expedition constituted a field army from a eastern field army after he just finished fighting the Persians. Nonetheless, it does indicate that an Illyrian frontier army did send a lot of forces, or necessarily did send forces to help fill out this expedition. So these Limentani aren't wrong, just the amount of proportion of them seems off. But yes, there would have been Limentani from the Illyrian frontier army in his expedition. And then John, when he was separated from the main force, he was usually separated with the best and primarily cavalrymen to be the vanguard, to move ahead of the force and to attack. And he fought in a few battles, famously the first Ad Decimum battle before Carthage. And then he was the one that went to go chase down Gilmar after Carthage was captured, Gilmar being the Vandal king. But here, as you can see, very few cavalrymen, this would have been right, but mainly just a field army, and again, just Limentani and Foederati again, which is interesting. And then over here, we have some cataphracti. Now, the only issue with this is what era they are. Once we get into the field battle, we can see if it's just the front half of the horse covered in armor, and the knight is kind of in a mishmash of armor, then that would be historically accurate to the time period. The later cataphracts, where the horse is completely covered in armor, and the knight kind of looks like this big onesie pajama set of mail, that's a later development. So we'll have to see when we get into the field battle how accurate that is. But overall, for starting off, the lack of a navy, not being near the settlement Procopius mentions they land, and probably the most egregious missing piece here is no Massagetae, which were the Huns. Procopius mentions when they land in North Africa, Belisarius had amassed 10,000 spearmen and 5,000 horsemen. Well, this composition doesn't look like to indicate that, and nowhere there's any Hunnic warriors, which would have been mainly horse archers. They don't exist here. And then the next weirdest thing is they can add things to their encampment, so they almost behave like this nomadic horde army, which is not what Belisarius was when he landed. They immediately landed with the idea to liberate territory, and they were being supplied by their navy. So this idea that they're instead this horde army
Commander.
is rather bizarre.
Ready for orders.
That would have been like a barbarian, traveling nomadic barbarian Hun thing. So this is an interesting choice. This was clearly a gameplay decision, because there's nothing indicating that he behaved like this at all in his expedition and his conquest. If you look at units he can recruit, you can see he has a list of units he can recruit, and it's right here. Foderate Horse Archers, which would have been your Hunnic Horse Archers. It's interesting they called them Foderate instead of Massate, or just Hunnic Horse Archers. But this right here, so even though he doesn't start with them, you can recruit them. I'm assuming maybe from reserves farther in camp. That's kind of an abstraction of how that's done. But so here we go. You can recruit the Hunnic Horse Archers. And other cavalry already have. But see, there's as beyond the Limitani, there are famous skirmisher units of Secretari. A little bit bizarre. But you can get the Horse Archers, and I'm assuming the idea here is for gameplay decisions, you upgrade these buildings, and then it gives you better access. Yeah, as you can see here, it gives you better access to more types of units. So as a start off, they made tremendous sacrifices or concessions to not make the army, I guess, be as strong or as powerful for gameplay reasons, but it also sacrificed a lot of the actual composition of what the army had. And the weird decision to make this operate kind of like this nomadic horde army, and the utter lack of the naval gameplay is really the biggest disappointment here. And then we'll move on to a next save file I have where I've progressed. And you can see here. We have already made it to Carthage. And what's interesting about this is that Carthage, there actually really wasn't a battle. Guillemar fled it because the walls were not repaired or fixed well enough. They were left in disarray. And Carthage, he was easily able to enter in without a fight and was viewed as a liberator. And he actually famously, Belisarius, demanded that no territory be conquered or looted or pillaged. It was to be liberated for East Roman Empire. And what's interesting happens here, when you liberate territory, it instantly goes to the Roman Empire and you have no control over it. Now, historically, according to Procopius, that's not what happened. They were also the administrators and the governors of this territory after they conquered it, because there was no way for Justinian to know how their success was going. So Belisarius, when he did take Carthage, rebuilt the walls and lived, fabulously in the palace. So a little bizarre of a decision that instantly goes to the empire, and it's out of your control. You're really just a military governor here. No, we won't fight this battle. We'll fight another one. But you win conquering the city in Libya from the Vandals, and you're given the option to reclaim it, which gives it straight to the Justinian, to the empire, without any much insight or input, which is a little bizarre because that's not how that happened. But you have the opportunity to declare independence, which ends the expedition immediately, and you become an enemy of Justinian, a rebel, a usurper. And obviously, Procopius mentions that fallaciously officers under Belisarius tried to tell the emperor that Belisarius was trying to make a king of himself in North Africa. Now, this, of course, was a rumor and a lie to try and smear Belisarius of his glory and fame and to make, Justinian fearful of him. But it is interesting that the game allows you to get into kind of alternative history where you can make your own history and do what Belisarius was accused of trying to do when he was in North Africa. So that's a cool little option there. But we give that to the Empire. And with that, you can see that there's much more of North Africa to conquer. You have Numidia, and we'll show again real quick some more territory deeper in the campaign after I've successfully conquered most of the Vandal Empire, like Belisarius did. When I conquered Carthage, the Vandals, who were actually up in over here in southern Italy in Sardinia came fleeing back by sea to meet up with Gillimer, who fled after he lost at the famous Battle of Ad Decimum. And you can see here, they're actually fleeing to regroup. So that's actually cool, and they're trying to take some territory over here that was abandoned. That didn't happen, but the fact that they're fleeing and regrouping, Gilmar and everyone, that did happen, according to Procopius. And I sent John, the Armenian,
ready for orders,
and a huge contingent cavalry to chase after him, as what Belisarius told John to do. So the game is more or less sandbox, and you kind of can create your own history, but you can, for the most part, lay out the events that historically occurred, if you so choose to. And it seems the AI will occasionally replicate or follow the historical events as best as they can, with the indication of the Vandals fleeing from southern Italy to come back and help Gillimer after Gillimer calls for aid when the Romans start conquering most of the empire for a last-ditch effort to fight in the next battle. So that was cool to see that happen. And from here, we'll actually play the historical battle at Decimum, because it didn't happen in my playthrough. They were kind of a cakewalk to breeze through. And so we will go to the actual historical battle and look at the forces composition of the units and how historically accurate the strategies and tactics are. But as for the campaign, this right here took a couple hours. It was pretty fun, but the lack of naval gameplay, the weird decision to make the Roman armies like these weird horde nomadic armies,
ready for battle,
a lot of historical inaccuracy. But some of it was for a sacrifice of gameplay, but other parts of it just seems kind of unexplainable. The naval gameplay, lacking it, is very bizarre. And I think the decision was they just didn't want to add that extra element into it, which is unfortunate. But we'll check out how well they portray the field battles in the next section then. All right, hello and welcome to the historical battle that the last Roman allows you to play. And this historical battle is Ad Decimum, and this was where Belisarius marched out of Carthage to meet Gillimer, and was the decisive battle that allowed him to conquer all of North Africa. So what's interesting is in the campaign, it's rather more sandbox, and you can't really control how that plays out. But this historical battle that the game gives you allows you to relive the battle and, I guess, play it how you want, or theoretically even lose the battle. Here is the Romans, over there are the Vandals, and we're going to look at the unit sizes and composition first to see how authentic it is, according to Procopius's History of the Wars, the historian that was embedded with Belisarius at the time. And then Justinian's Men talks about unit sizes, and then the Strategigon by Emperor Maurice talks about unit composition, strategies, and army sizes. So we'll see how accurate the game is in authentically replicating that. So we'll start off with some more familiar stuff. We'll start with the infantry. And interestingly enough, we have the Protectors Domestici. And what this would mean would be personal guardians. And guardsmen, as they were called, were accurate. Most of the generals, such as Belisarius, famously had hundreds up to thousands of guardsmen. And these were kind of the elite, hand-chosen units that Roman generals and officers would have protecting them. Think of them as kind of like the honor guard in modern-day contemporary meanings. And a lot of these times, these would be family members or people related to his clan, and kind of a promotion, an end goal promotion for a lot of the regular soldiers to end up in these units. So these ones would be specifically the guardsmen of Belisarius because of the Domestici, which would mean domestic. And then we'll come back to these guys in a second, but over here we can find... Here we go, more guardsmen. And then interestingly enough, some Palatina guards, which obviously these come from the Praetorians back in the Western Roman Empire, and just mean palace guard. And from what I can tell, I'm not too sure if any palace guards came with Belisarius. So this is interesting that they're showing some in the army. Doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Just never heard of it. As we can see here too, chainmail has really started to take over. And that's also accurate. They moved away from the Laminel armor, the Segmenta armor that they're more famous for. during the height of the Imperial Roman Empire, since this is 6th century. However, the regalia and awards, as you can see here on the leader, the officer of this unit, that's still happening. That is still accurate. You can see the shields have become rounded. This is also accurate. They were no longer square. They would become rounded shields so they could fight better individually. But they would still also make spear walls or shield walls. Over here, we have some light cavalry. Nothing to indicate inaccuracy about this. That was definitely a thing. Cavalry were a large staple of the Byzantine army at this time. And then here we would have your equites, which would indicate maybe some level of nobility. Equite was usually of the higher class in Roman society. Here we have a very interesting camel unit, an imperial. So these actually would have came from the east, and according to Justinian's Men, that book, secondary source that consolidated a lot of primary sources and events to structure the Byzantine army, a large force of Belisarius' expedition did come from an eastern field army, and we'll talk about field armies and frontier armies in a second. So this would also be accurate. Camels were not mentioned specifically by Procopius. That doesn't mean that this couldn't have happened, especially if the units were coming from an eastern field army after fighting the Persians, which Belisarius did. Here we have the Comitatensis, and this is important. So this is the big distinction between Comitatensis and, if we come back, I believe right here, here we go. The big difference, I'll compare them together. The Limentani. So the Limentani would have been your frontier armies. And that's the big distinction in 6th century Byzantine military structure, is you had two types of militaries, or two types of armies. You had the Limentani, which were your frontier field armies, and these would have been more like militiamen or like guardsmen in a modern day setting. And your Comitatenses would have been part of your actual field army. So these are the armies that would be mobile. These are the ones that would be invading or performing aggressive actions, such as Belisarius' expedition. And so this would have been the mainstay of his army, would have been the Comitatensis. And as you can see here, some of these individuals don't look Roman at all. They look like they're from numerous barbarian factions. So it's really cool that the game modeled this correctly, because the Comitatensis really was interested in recruiting you could say, career soldiers, professional soldiers. So, and as a way of finding people to join the army, they would commonly recruit large tribal groups that were on the borders of the Roman Empire that the emperors would make peace deals with. So this was not unheard of, and a lot of the Comitatenses field army units would have been of some sort of barbarian tribe working directly in a Roman field army. So this is not unheard of. The mixturing of barbarians with regular Greek and Latin Romans, nothing to indicate that that necessarily wouldn't have occurred either, though more likely they would have been segregated more at this time. And then if we come back to the Limentani, these are usually, again, viewed more kind of like militiamen. So these would have been soldiers that would have received land to live on the frontiers or the borders of the empire in exchange for military duty. So they would not be people that would be mobile that much, and they actually would have been ruled by a frontier border governor, which would have been called a duke. That's where duke comes from. So dukes would have been running these armies, and it's not unheard of that Limentani would have joined in an offensive operation, like in a conquest, if they were bordering the territory where the army was being attacked or where the field army was invading. But it's very unlikely there would have been many Limentani in Belisarius' expedition in North Africa, because that's where this battle is at Decimum, that this is a circle battle occurring. However, there is indication that the Illyrian frontier armies did send forces to Belisarius' expedition, and according to Procopius, 10,000 spearmen and 5,000 horsemen landed in North Africa. So, this is definitely plausible. That clearly stated who came. If you were to base it off the Strategigon by Maurice and Justinian's men, it would have been more likely that you would have only had Comitensis, but you could also have a Lementani, and that clearly is what the game designers decided to do. And then let's see a few more things. Numeroi. These are interesting. These are kind of more or less like a private bodyguard force, heavy infantry. Kind of your more elite. So again, nothing indicating they couldn't be here. This is interesting. Pikemen. Nothing indicated by Procopius or necessarily even by the Strategigon or Justinian's men indicated that there would be any pikemen in the army. And if they did, they probably would have been a mercenary force, but there was nothing indicating here by the name that that is the case. So this is interesting. Again, not that this wouldn't have happened, but when Procopius covered the battle of Ad Decimum, no indication that there was pikemen or indication that there were camels. Again, doesn't mean that it couldn't have happened. And maybe they found sources better that indicated that that did occur. Now these guys, the Saigetatari, very famous, so these would have been the skirmisher units. And in this case, that's what they're doing, they're light bowmen. They were definitely a staple of the Byzantine army. Eventually, and maybe even beginning in this time period, these roles would start to be getting combined with the frontline infantrymen. The frontline infantrymen would be archers and swordsmen or spearmen. But at this stage, they're still separate. Nothing to indicate that that would be necessarily inaccurate. And then you have these guys, which are kind of like the scouts or the navigators. Not really talked about in Justinian's men or by Procopius, though they are mentioned in the Strategigon by Marcus. And these would have been the scouts. And so, and their role is what indicates kind of the vanguard or forward unit. So yeah, there's nothing saying that why they couldn't be here either. Just because Procopius doesn't bring it up doesn't mean that they weren't here. And then, the interesting thing, at Decimum, historically, according to Procopius, the Huns, which are called the Massagetae by Procopius and the Romans, they were being courted by the Vandals to betray them or turn sides. Belisarius found this out, and essentially it was able to make the Huns agree that if they won't get involved in the battle, and if they did, they would join the winning side. Now, there's no indication how many Huns he brought. It would have been likely that there was quite a significant number of Huns, probably at least a couple thousand of the 5,000 horsemen that came would have been Huns. However, in this battle, there's very little, so I don't know if that's the game deciding that he only brought a few Huns, and from my indication, that necessarily would have not been very accurate because they were a big trouble and worry aspect for Belisarius before this battle if the Huns would stay loyal or not. Ultimately, they stayed uninvolved, and then Belisarius' side won, and the Huns helped run down the fleeing Vandals. So it's interesting that they're here in this battle at the very moment, though. They didn't really participate into the ending route. And then over here, you have your Cataphractii. And this is interesting. So these are the guys before the cataphracts. And the reason why you can tell this, and they did this correctly, is that the armor for the horses is only on the frontal half. The later cataphracts would have had armor over the entire cavalry, over the entire horse, and the cavalrymen would have been draped in almost kind of like this onesie, sleeping pajama-looking set of chainmail. Here it's still kind of separated in multiple different pieces. You would have actually saw this down here, like European knights go all the way up. So this is the stage before the full-on cataphract. So this is accurate for this time period. So they got this pretty right. And these are obviously the heavy cavalry, the predecessors to the knights. The Romans stole these from the Sassanids and the Persians with how effective they were. And then, yep, the rounds. You have your guardsmen. These are your domestic, your private guardsmen, some palace guards, which are interesting, some pikemen. And then the only things that are iffy to me would have been the pikemen and the camels, but I'm assuming they must have found some sort of source that would have indicated why they were here. Now, very interesting enough, what they did, they took this inspiration from Procopius. If we go over to the Vandals, you can see that the Vandals are predominantly horses. I don't know if this composition was this severe in the battle. The battle also took place on a river, so it was kind of happening, well, not necessarily a river, a brook. And we'll get to that in a second. So the idea that this is happening just on the road is interesting, but that's fine. That's not the end of the world. But it would have been more by a brook, is what Procopius mentions. But Procopius mentions that the Vandals, Gilomir, their king, ordered them not to have any spears, only swords. And as you can see here, all the infantrymen, they're called berserkers in the game, but they're all swordsmen. So they clearly believed or followed what Procopius said. And their infantrymen were only all swordsmen, and that ended up being to the detriment of their fighting capabilities in this battle. The rest are just all cavalry, which the Vandals had a lot of. Interestingly enough, you see that there is a lot of Moorish cavalry, right? Which would have been indigenous North Africans and Numidians. And it's interesting that these guys are already here. There's nothing to say that they couldn't have been here, but according to Procopius, when Gilomar was defeated this battle, he fled into Numidia and started gathering Moorish cavalry. So the fact that they're already here is interesting. That may be a bit of an anachronism. Not necessarily, I mean, the Vandals are running North Africa, so it's possible they were to call up levies, and that could have been something just Procopius didn't notice or mention in the sources when he was writing this down. And then obviously you have, this would be that kind of the house guard, the bodyguards. This is what would have been protecting King Gilomar himself. Your elites, your chosen, as the Vandals called them. And then the rest of these are just, they call them raiders. The Warlord's Guard. This is where Gilomar would be with his guard. The elite house guard. And the rest are just kind of barbarian raiders. If they would have called themselves raiders that, I don't know. I doubt it. I don't even know if they would have called themselves berserkers. This may be terminology given more from Procopius, who is obviously more disparaging against the Vandals. But as you can see, overwhelmingly just a cavalry force. From the Battle of Ad Decimum, it didn't indicate that was necessarily the case. How the battle actually went out was it was a brook, and Belisarius ordered John, the Armenian, to send forces to cross the river, the brook, to feint the Vandals, to break them out of their formations to chase back, so that they would be out of organization, so that then the Roman units could move in and cause chaos and clean up. And John does that a couple times and eventually succeeds, and then the rest of the Roman army crosses the brook and makes short work of them. There's no, small river here, it's just the road and desert. So that isn't going to happen, and it looks like, as you'll see when I unpause the game, the Vandals are about to begin invading. Or not invading, begin attacking aggressively very quickly. So, historically accurate for how the battle went out according to Procopius, it looks like no. And then one more thing before we unpause the battle, let it unfold. The unit sizes. So a legion at this time would have been much smaller than the traditional Roman legion of upwards of 6,000. It would have only been around 1,000 men, and that would have been in a frontier army and 500 men in a field army, according to the Strategigon and to Justinian's men. In that book, that's how much smaller legions would have been. And then legions would have been further broken down into battalions of 500 men, and then even furthermore into groups of around 100. So as you can see here, most of these units have 120 men, a little bit more than what it would have been probably just around 100. But this is fine and close enough, right? If there was more than 100 men, the extra men would have been like service personnel. They would have not been fighters. They would have been like cooks and baggage train people carrying the supplies. So the fact that they chose 120 is interesting, but that's close enough to the size of what it would have been a centurion, but they had a different name for it in Greek. But that would have been your smallest, largest unit that would be moved around. And then it would have broken down into units of 10 and 5. And the groups of 5 would have been like your squads, like similar to modern day squad. But they would have never personally fought individually, maybe on garrison or patrol duty they would have. But you would have a group of 5 where you'd have 3 men in the front and 2 men behind. So this section right here would have been a squad of 5. And then 3 in the front, 2 behind. 3 in the front, 2 behind is how they would have done it. I doubt the units will interact individually like that. I think they'll probably act in their size of their units. But for the infantry, at least, not too far off the mark of their smallest would have been around 100-man units. How they would have been moved around. So, not bad. All right, well, let's see how the battle goes. Again, this is already breaking way off from what historically happened, but we'll see how the cavalry goes and how well the units do it. Belisarius did have his cavalry on his flanks. That's not inaccurate. That it was correct. And that is in Fascial's normal fashion to Mars's Strategicon. Strategicon. There we go. It's hard to say that Greek word. Alright, let's see what happens.
The Vandals block the road ahead. Let us attack. Follow me.
Try to start leading these forces to see what happens.
Up to double. Palatina guards. Double time. March. North archers.
Now, camels historically scare horses, and I think in this game that does the same thing, so we'll try to use that to our advantage.
At speed. Advance at speed.
And you can see, actually, instead of attacking right off the bat, Vandals are making a new front line, mainly with their cavalry, and setting the Huns up to begin shooting. And you can actually choose their ammunition. Now, the flaming shot, that would have not happened on horse. It's kind of impossible, so it's funny that that's an option for them. But hey, whatever.
At your service.
Forces moved up a little more.
At speed. Dominate. Protected as domesticity. Quickly now.
The archers will start doing
Equites promoting.
some damage. And maybe we'll try to replicate John and see if we can bait them to attack and then retreat real quick.
Secretariat.
Interesting ability. Precision shot.
Archers.
So everyone's set up, we can see what happens here.
You come on.
The graphics and detail are great for the units. I mean, mercenary Bosphorus warriors, these would have been from around the Black Sea. Very interesting. Again, did not hear how they would have necessarily ended up in North Africa. Doesn't mean it wouldn't have happened, though. The Byzantine army, according to Justine's men, was constantly moving forces around to form these kind of like these patchwork armies, especially the field armies. So no reason why they want to have mercenaries like that. Looks like he sent his raiders forward to attack my Huns, and I'm sending my forces in to fight them. You can see combat is hectic and crazy. This time period. Animations are pretty good.
That is insolent.
Looks like we got one of them to rout.
Equites promoting.
Like cavalry to help with the attack. Send some reinforcements.
Force archers.
Being my shock cavalry, I don't want to chase light cavalry with them. So we're going to avoid doing that.
Palatina Guards! Mandata Tour!
And we'll chase them with our light infantry. Light cavalry. There we go. Now they switch to swords when they have them. Very good. Let's see, we have another attack over here.
Libertadi!
I don't think they're going to do well against our heavy cavalry.
Equites Promoti! Melee infantry at your command! Quick march! For the guards! Postmodern warriors!
And looks like these guys are one guy left.
Heavy horse at your command! Swords, men! Swords!
And yeah, so a heavy duty cavalry, heavy armored cavalry, and not stand a chance. Now the cavalry have been charging into each other loosely. That's not totally off from what would happen. The cavalry would actually rarely charge against an infantry unit. Horses don't like charging into a thick wall of material, especially if it's not moving. So it's actually kind of a Hollywood thing to see horses charge headfirst into a thick line of dudes with, you know, pointy things sticking out. They would usually flank around or bait them or try to scare them into routing. And if the men routed, you know, they broke their lines, and the horsemen would chase after them and cut them down. But they wouldn't actually do crazy suicidal charges as you usually see in a lot of Hollywood movies. So maybe we'll see how authentic the game is to real life. Ancient warfare tactics. We can see how well this unit does charging into the unit of first while them charging into each other. Obviously, if it's not totally accurate, still very repeated. Routed again. And it looks like they're sending a lot more. So let's get more cavalry over here.
Victory for Rome!
No, swordsmen aren't the best thing to fight against cavalry because of the reach. But we should probably send them to help. There we go, they're attacking archers. It's a smart move finally.
Deal! Horse archers!
I think it's time to deal with these remaining cavalry over here. I think to start moving up the forces. Oh, and here we go. The AI does very clever attacking infantry from behind. I was able to turn around and get a good charge off. So, did not last too long. Oh, here we go. Here's a charge. And see, that worked out perfectly. They charge into the pikes, and the perfectly all died. So again, they perfectly explained why horses would not actually charge into a big wall of spearmen. It goes disastrous. Now, realistically, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. The horses would have been like, no, I'm not doing that. But at least the game portrayed how devastating it would have been if you made such a terrible decision. So that's good to see. Now the fighting is just getting kind of hectic and all over the place, which is great. As you see, the swordsmen quickly tear through the spearmen. That was a tactical failure on my part. We're sending up our swordsmen, we're sending up our guardsmen. And yet, against unarmored berserkers, they don't really stand a chance. Now, them being half naked like this, from everything I read and could see, this was inaccurate. They would have not fought as naked like this at this time. As earlier barbarians in the earlier centuries, they would have just wore the trousers and that with the big shields. But from what I could tell, the Vandals, once they settled into North Africa, right, they've been here for almost a century at this point when Belisarius goes back. It's unlikely they would have continued these types of traditions. They actually had no connection with the homeland. They were completely separate at this point. They had no relations with where the Vandals originated in Central Europe. So this idea that they would have maintained very strict traditions like this, especially in a very hot place, the sunburns and skin cancer would have been terrible. This is probably very unlikely. They probably would have started adopting some of the clothing, maybe more like this guy at least, to have some protection from the heat. So this, I think, was more for flavor, or maybe just an oversight. But yes, they fought like this centuries earlier, but now like this in North Africa, no indication from Procopius or Justinian's when they behaved or fought like this. So I would have to say this probably did not work. Interesting that the warlord's holding back here. I'm just watching the remnants of his forces. Some pretty good animations here, especially for such a large-scale battle. This type of game is very cool. Classic barbarian top knot too, which is great. And here we go, we've surrounded this guy. And we're attacking the warlord. Now Gilmore actually got away from this battle. He fled. The fact he stayed is interesting. His brother actually died when John the Armenian was able to successfully ruse the enemy into routing, or into breaking formation to charge across the brook. And
The general has fallen. Our victory grows
when
ever nearer.
Gilmore found out that his brother died, he lost heart and fled the battlefield. Here we just heard that Gilmore died. And that interesting feinting of the retreat that John the Armenian did, that was from the Stratagegon. To pretend you're withdrawing with your force to break the enemy out of cohesion, to then quickly turn on counterattack. So that was accurate. So seeing how Procopius portrayed those events was accurate. At the Battle of Decimum, obviously there wasn't much opportunity to pull that off here. There was no brook or river to begin with. And as you can see, the battle is now over as the wrap up. Still very visceral, violent battlefield as wars are. And see a few stragglers and surrounded. So we have two Vandals left over here, and they're winning. Make of that you will. The Palatine are coming in. Wow, okay, this guy. Is a superhero.
At your service. Advance at speed.
That she erupted pretty fast. And there you have it. So that was the Battle of Decimum. Allowed you to replay the historical battle. The only problem is it wasn't at a brook. See over here. This would have been more accurate. Now this is kind of a larger river, and it was indicated to be that
The
big.
blockade has been crushed. The Vandals have been swept aside.
But this
Onwards to Carthage, soldiers.
is interesting. That
A
this battle
glorious
happened here.
victory will soon be yours.
And that they betrayed. It is possible that this was meant to be the first battle of Decimum. However, that would have been just with John and mainly just cavalrymen. So that would have made no sense if that was the case. This clearly would have been the second battle after Carthage. where you marched out to fight him. Nonetheless, that was a victory, and it was still fun, but obviously there were some glaring historical inaccuracies. As for the composition, the unit sizes of the Romans seem to be alright. Some questionable additions, as the, camels and pikemen, no indication that they existed, though they may have found their own sources for that. But beyond that, not too terrible. Pretty good faithful representation of historical battle, and the fact that you get to play it yourself is cool. And the animations and models are excellent for the units here. Very lively, very immersive. So, still pretty cool.